But let me also comment on the liberal international order. I'm not sure where that came from. Certainly when China signed up to the WTO, it wasn't told it was signing up to the liberal international order. It wasn't such thing. I mean, I think it was made up in retrospect. I mean, I think when President Jiang went to Washington, when China was trying to enter the WTO, President Bill Clinton didn't say, hey, President Jiang, you're signing up to the liberal international order. It didn't happen. So it was never there.
嗨，欢迎大家来到果果的新闻频道。本期重要看点：当美国教授指责中国违反自由国际秩序时，中国学者李世默的第一句话让全场鸦雀无声。我们加入 WTO 的时候，招股说明书里也没有写着这一条啊。克林顿总统也没跟主席说过要签什么自由国际秩序，这东西根本不存在啊，是你们后来编出来的。更狠的还在后面。当美国教授说我们帮中国发展是个错误时，李世默冷笑道：别装了，你们请我们加入可不是做慈善，是因为你们能赚钱。最打脸的是半导体封锁，李世默直言拜登一刀切反而把中国叫醒了。我们的 STEAM 学生比全世界加起来的还多，研发资金也是最多的。你要是觉得我们搞不定芯片，那真是在开玩笑。一场4季辩论，中国学者如何用逻辑碾压美国教授的傲慢。今天我们就来看看这场精彩的交锋，请看前方发来的报道。
What do you think about globalization nowadays?
I think the most important event in recent years was when we transitioned from unipolarity to multipolarity. I think when one wants to assess international relations, the first question you want to ask yourself is, what does the structure of the international system look like? I was born in 1947 during the Cold War, and we lived until 1989 in a bipolar world. There were two great powers on the planet, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War ended, and then we moved into a unipolar world. And I would imagine most people in the audience came of age during the unipolar moment when there was only one great power in the system, and that was the United States of America. That world went away in roughly 2017, and we now live in a world where there are three great powers. The structure of the system has an enormous influence on how states interact with each other, and it has an enormous impact on globalization. During the Cold War, when I was young, there was really no globalization, in large part because there were two different worlds, the communist world and the Western world. And people in Hungary lived in a communist order or a Soviet-led order. Hungary belonged to the Warsaw Pact. It didn't belong to NATO. What then happened is the Cold War ended in 1989, and you had a unipole. And once you have a unipole, you get globalization, because the United States runs around the world running things. It creates a global economic order. It brings countries like Russia and Hungary, Russia for a while, Hungary up until this present day, into this globalized order. But what's happened is we've left unipolarity and we moved into multipolarity. And what you see happening is that globalization, that global order, that liberal international order that existed during unipolarity has fallen apart. And what you're getting is a new order. You're seeing a country like China trying to influence the order by building its own institutions, by shaping how states interact with each other through organizations like BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative. So what I would say is that moving forward, you're not going to see anything like that globalization that you saw during the unipolar moment, in large part because the foundation has changed. We've gone from unipolarity to multipolarity.
I think the last round of globalization, which has been about 30 years, maybe 40 years, had, of course, generated tremendous amount of economic prosperity and wealth. And China certainly was one of the largest beneficiaries of this globalization, and so has the United States been. Both of our countries' GDP went up significantly. China went up a lot more because we began at a lower base. But the problem with globalization as it stands is, I think, it cannot go on for two reasons. One is, I think, within the United States and the West, somehow the economic benefits derived from globalization weren't distributed in a way that satisfied multiple segments of its population. So it's led to an internal revolt against globalization. So the architect of this first round of globalization is having internal resistance to it. So that's, of course, leading to deglobalization, because the leader of the globalization was saying, we don't want to do this anymore. And the second issue is, of course, that the largest developing country that participated in globalization was China. And in the beginning, I think they had designed it in a way that the US and Western countries were at the core of globalization, and there were countries, developing countries, at the periphery. And the division of labor was clear. You know, the US and Western Europe were going to be in charge of R&D and finance and military, and we're going to do cheap labor and sell natural resources if we had them. China didn't have them, but others had them, and provide market. But of course, as China grew, it said, no, we didn't agree to that. We're going to move up the value chain. And unfortunately, the US and certain Western countries, they thought this was perceived as a threat. So they didn't want to do that anymore. So I think we're in, globalization is in trouble. But let me also comment on the liberal international order. I'm not sure where that came from. Certainly when China signed up to the WTO, it wasn't told it was signing up to the liberal international order. It wasn't such thing. I mean, I think it was made up in retrospect. I mean, I think when President Jiang went to Washington, when China was trying to enter the WTO, President Bill Clinton didn't say, hey, President Jiang, you're signing up to the liberal international order. It didn't happen. So it was never there. So that's my 2 cents.
Eric made the point that both China and the United States got much richer during the unipolar moment when we had globalization. And he's, of course, correct. And the United States didn't care about that because the United States thought that once China got really rich and it got embedded in international institutions, it would become a responsible stakeholder, to use Robert Zoellick's term, and then it would become a democracy, and once it was a democracy, we'd all live happily ever after. This would be the end of history. That was the basic idea. But it didn't turn out that way because once China got really powerful economically, it translated that economic might into military might, and it began to throw its muscle around. And this, of course, scared the living bejesus out of the Americans, and the Americans have moved to counter China. We now care about relative gains. See, Eric was talking about absolute gains where we're both getting rich. And we didn't care about relative gains then. But now that China's a great power, we care about relative gains. So what we want to do is we want to maximize American growth, and we want to minimize Chinese growth. Anything we can do to slow down the Chinese economy and refurbish the American economy, we will do. And you see this reflected in the competition over cutting-edge technologies. We're extremely scared that China is going to beat us in terms of developing cutting-edge technologies. Now, where do tariffs come in? Tariffs are part of the story. What we're trying to do with tariffs is modernize, refurbish the American industrial base, make us much more competitive, and we're trying to weaken China at the same time. Because again, we care about relative power. And all of this is to say that I agree with you, Liz, that we made a fundamental mistake in the 1990s and in the first 20 years of the 21st century in helping China to become Godzilla. It's come back to haunt us, and we're now trying to rectify that. And again, tariffs are part of that story.
Let me comment on that.
Let Eric comment on this.
I think of course, like I said, both countries benefit tremendously. But if the United States, certainly the US did not set up the system and ask China to join out of charity. I really don't think so. They thought that they would benefit too. That's number one. Number two, if the US thought that if China develops and eventually it will become a liberal country, they never told us that. Nobody told us that. It was a secret intent. It wasn't disclosed in the prospectus. Okay, we signed up to WTO, and there was a prospectus. There were a bunch of rules, a lot of text, a lot of words, nothing in it that said, hey, if your economy develops, you must become a liberal society. It wasn't there. We didn't sign up to that, like I said. So I think, well, look, if the U.S. is now changing its path, changing its direction, that's completely within its power to do. It's a sovereign nation. Tariffs and all of that, if the globalization, if the United States wants to ditch globalization for its own needs, I think China will adapt. Everybody has to adapt. It's okay. I think China will do okay in this new era, and it will adapt.
John.
Yeah, if I can just say a word, picking up on what you said. I think the way to think about the world we're moving into is to separate the economic from the security competition, and think about it in the context of the pre-World War I period, not the Cold War. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, what is he talking about? Before World War I, here in Europe, there was a huge amount of economic intercourse among all of the states. There was a huge amount of economic interdependence here in Europe. Nevertheless, at the same time, you had two powerful security blocs. One was the Triple Entente, which was France, Britain, and Russia, and the other was the Triple Alliance. Germany, of course, was the key player, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And you had this intense security competition before World War I that, of course, in August 1914, led to World War I. But at the same time you had this intense security competition, you had all this economic interdependence. Fast forward to the Cold War, when I grew up, there was hardly any economic intercourse between the West and the East. So there was security competition, but no economic intercourse. The situation moving forward is going to look like the pre-World War I period. It's not going to look like the Cold War. There's going to be a great deal of economic intercourse between India and China, the United States and China, Europe and China. The key issue inside the economic realm will have to do with high-edge or cutting-edge technologies. That's what the United States really cares about in terms of the competition with China. And just to take Europe and how this competition will affect Europe, there's no question, given the economic state of Europe, that European states will have a powerful incentive to want to trade with China. And the United States will tolerate that as long as Europeans don't trade cutting-edge technologies to the Chinese. Because what the Americans are trying to do, as Eric knows very well, is the Americans are trying to throttle slow down China's development of cutting-edge technologies. And the United States is not going to be happy if Europe trades cutting-edge technologies or technologies that feed into cutting-edge technologies with China. But nevertheless, Europeans, Americans, Indians, we're going to trade with the Chinese. But at the same time, you're going to have a wicked and very dangerous security competition in East Asia for many, many years moving forward.
Eric?
I think if the United States wants to contain China through technological means, which is understandable, then I think they're pursuing very mistaken tactics. I mean, I don't understand why. I mean, by cutting off semiconductor, for instance, when Mr. Biden did, and the Chinese were asleep at the wheel for a long time on the stuff. They woke up the Chinese and said, whoa, this is what they could do to us. And listen, we graduate more STEM students than the rest of the world combined. Okay, and we got research dollars more than the rest of the world combined. If you don't think we can lick semiconductor, you gotta be out to lunch. I mean, so I just don't think that's the productive way to go about it. And by the way, I totally understand. I think the Chinese understand the U.S. wants to reindustrialize. If I were running the United States, I would want to reindustrialize too. I just wish there could be a friendlier way to go about it externally. And I actually think, that's why I'm actually reasonably optimistic. I actually think the Chinese would be willing to cooperate and maybe contribute to that effort. Certainly China is the largest industrial power in the world. There's some kind of accommodation that could be reached, I believe, if we pursue a friendlier atmosphere.
I think I'm going to focus mainly on the Russia-Europe relationship moving forward. I think relations between Russia and Europe are going to be poisonous and very dangerous for as far as the eye can see. I think the April 2008 decision to bring Ukraine into NATO and then doubling down on that at every point moving forward was a disastrous mistake. It led to the February 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine and the present war that's now confronting us. I do not believe there is a meaningful peace settlement to this war. I think that the Russians on one side and the Ukrainians in the West on the other side are so far apart on what terms are satisfactory for ending the conflict that it's not going to be ended peacefully. You're going to end up with a frozen conflict. And when you get that frozen conflict, the Russians are going to be seen to have been the winners. The end result is that the West and the Ukraine will go to great lengths to undermine Russia's position in the part of Ukraine that they annex. At the same time, the Russians will go to great lengths to make sure that Ukraine is a dysfunctional rump state and do everything they can to wreck the politics and economics of Ukraine. The West, of course, save for a few countries, will have terrible relations with the Russians and do everything possible to undermine Russia's position. So if you look at just Russia versus Ukraine and Russia versus the West, in the wake of a frozen conflict, it looks terrible. Superimposed on this frozen conflict are at least 5 big potential flashpoints that could lead to a hot war. 1 is the Arctic, 2 is the Baltic Sea, 3 is Kaliningrad, 4 is Belarus, 5 is Moldova, and there's a 6th one, the Black Sea. These are all locations in Eastern Europe where big trouble could start and easily start because of the poisonous relations between Russia and Ukraine and between Russia and the United States. So I think moving forward, it's going to be a very difficult time for the Europeans and for the Russians and certainly for the Ukrainians.
What is the Indian and Chinese perspective on this?
On Europe, well, if you listen to the big boys and girls in Brussels or in the big capitals, you get the sense that they are pounding their chests to take over the mantle of the liberal international order now that the US is kind of abandoning it. So we're not sure what to do. We're not sure whether we should tell them come on or to cheer them on. I think Europe should kind of make up its mind on what it wants to do. And you know, if you listen to the current US government, their narrative on the conflict in Ukraine is now almost identical to what China has been saying for 3 years, okay, to the words. It's amazing. But now, you know, so I think Europe, it's a tough world out there. So maybe you don't change until, you know, you get mugged by reality. We'll see.
精彩视频看完了，在这场关于全球化与大国竞争的辩论中，美国国际关系学者米尔斯海默和中国政治学者李世默展现了截然不同的世界观。米尔斯海默从现实主义视角出发，将中国崛起视为美国的哥斯拉式威胁，认为美国当初帮助中国发展是根本性错误，而李世默则以冷静理性的态度逐一拆解了美方的论述逻辑。李世默最精彩的反击是对自由国际秩序的概念的质疑。当米尔斯海默声称中国应该成为负责任的利益相关者，并最终民主化时，李世默直言，中国加入 WTO 时，没人告诉我们要签署自由国际秩序啊，这东西根本不存在，是后来你们编的。克林顿总统当年没跟我们主席说要加入自由国际秩序啊，就是你们编的。招股说明书里也没这一条。这个反驳击中了要害。西方确实是在规则改变后才追加了民主化条件，这是典型的事后追责啊！中国遵守了 WTO 的所有明文规定，凭什么要为美国的秘密期待负责？针对米尔斯海默的暗示美国帮助中国发展的说法，李世默毫不客气地指出，美国建立这个体系并邀请中国加入，绝不是出于慈善，他们也认为自己会受益啊，这是常识。全球化是互利的，中美都是赢家。中国 GDP 增长更快只是因为基数低，这是经济规律，不是阴谋。在半导体技术封锁的问题上，李世默展现了战略自信。拜登切断半导体供应，反而把沉睡的中国叫醒了。我们培养的 STEAM 学生比全世界加起来还要多，研发资金也是。如果你觉得我们搞不定半导体，那真是开玩笑。他还表达了一种遗憾，如果美国想要振工业，中国其实愿意以更友好的方式配合，毕竟中国是世界最大的工业国，完全可以达成某种协议。当谈到欧洲时，李世默带着一丝幽默，欧洲的大人物们现在拍着胸脯说要接管自由国际秩序的大旗，既然美国不干了，我们不确定该劝他们还是为他们喝彩。言下之意，欧洲应该想清楚自己的利益，而不是盲目追随某种意识形态叙事。这场辩论清晰展现了中国知识分子的成熟与自信。李世默没有陷入情绪化争论，而是用事实、逻辑和规则说话。他的论述传递几个关键信息：第一，中国的发展是通过遵守规则、艰苦奋斗实现的，不欠任何人的；第二，不要用隐藏规则来指责中国，这不公平；第三，中国有能力适应任何新环境，包括全球化；第四，如果美国真想竞争，技术封锁恰恰会加速中国自主创新。米尔斯海默代表的是传统西方霸权思维，只能我强，你强就是威胁， 而李世默展现的是新兴大国的理性与包容。我们愿意合作，但绝不接受不平等规则。这场辩论的意义不在于谁说服了谁，而在于让世界看到中国已经有能力在国际舞台上平等对话，用逻辑而非情绪捍卫自己的正当权益。谢谢大家观看，喜欢请点赞、评论加订阅，你的支持是我最大动力。比心，明天见，拜拜。